Hi, this is Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, joined by Sheldon Richmond, the foundation's vice president. This is the Libertarian Angle, where we bring you the libertarian perspectives on what's going on in the world, the kind of perspective that we all know you're not going to get in the mainstream media, television, and so forth. Sheldon, I thought we'd talk about, Obamacare, since it's falling apart before our very eyes. This is one of those things where I predicted that they would need a reform to fix the reform, but quite honestly, I never thought that it would come out this soon. I mean, this thing is an absolute disaster. The website's a disaster, but that's really just a minor part of it. The whole thing just seems to be collapsing before our very eyes. Why would we expect anything different? I was reading an article in the New York Times this morning about the same type of thing that was done during the Reagan administration with, of course, the conservatives. And they were enacting something called the Medicare Catastrophic Coverage Act. And Reagan signed it into law, and his vice president, George W. Bush, wanted it signed into law because he thought it would be a big political advantage when he ran for president. The thing turned out to be such a disaster that it was immediately repealed. You think we'll see this with Obamacare, or are we just going to have to drag the country through this mess until it finally collapses somewhere down the line?
Well, like you say, it was all predictable. The website is a minor part of all this, which is why most people who defend the Affordable Care Act want to talk about the website, because that's potentially fixable. They didn't anticipate, although they should have, the volume, so they couldn't handle it. And I would imagine that's fixable. What they really don't want to spend time talking about is the core of the ACA, because that's not fixable. And the reason it's not fixable is it clashes with just basic laws of economics. They had every reason to know, and I think there's evidence that they discussed this and knew it, that a lot of people in the individual market, that is people who buy their medical coverage, don't get it through their employer, but venture out and buy it on their own, were going to get cancellation notices. They knew that was going to happen because the whole premise of Obamacare, of the ACA, is that everyone has to have a policy, a coverage that satisfies government-written standards generated by the Department of Health and Human Services, and they knew that under that strict set of criteria, that a lot of people would not be able to keep their coverage, and yet Obama, of course, was going all over the country at the time, and even since after the passage of the act, saying that if you like your doctor, you can keep him. If you like your coverage, you can keep it. And he knew that wasn't going to be true. He knew for millions of people that was not going to be true. So it was a lie. He got caught in it. I think it's another example where people rising up in disgust forced Obama to make some change. Obviously, not a very radical change. Didn't really go to the root of the problem. But he's now put this off, these cancellations off for a year. I compare it to what happened with Syria, where public disgust forced the change by Obama. Now, again, I concede that it was not a radical change, but he still had to back away from these cancellations, although people still may face the cancellations because you have insurance companies and state insurance commissioners saying, well, I'm not so sure we can go back on what we've already set in motion. So it's possible that Obama has wrought changes that can't simply be undone the way he's now promising that they will be. So I agree with you. It was flawed. It's flawed at its core. You can't repeal the laws of economics, which is what Congress and Obama tried to do, and they're learning the lesson.
But I don't understand how they're going to do this reinstatement of insurance policies. I mean, is this a new method of coercion that they're now going to initiate against American insurance companies? Are they going to order these insurance companies to reinstate policies that have been canceled? Are they going to issue an edict that says we prohibit you from doing this? Do you know how that's going to work?
Well, according to what he said, it's not an edict and it's not mandatory. It's just saying you don't have to cancel them. Under the original plan, they would have had to cancel them because they didn't fulfill the criteria. The policies that were getting canceled in the view of the Obama administration were substandard or subpar or bare bones, as they call it. Now, you have to understand what they mean by that. These are policies people chose, policies that fit their budgets, fit their particular situations. Now, a big asterisk has to be put next to this. We don't have a free market in insurance. We did not have a free market in insurance before March of 2010 when Obamacare was signed. Every state runs a regulatory cartel in partnership with the insurance industry, so there's nothing like a free market. But nevertheless, within that context, people were picking insurance. Now the government comes along and says, well, those are substandard policies. Why are they substandard? Well, perhaps they don't include drug treatment. In case somebody has a problem with heroin or some kind of drug or even a prescription drug, they might not have bought treatment for that. Well, some people don't want to buy treatment for that. That costs something. And they don't feel they're going to have a drug problem, so they don't want to buy insurance. That's an intelligent decision people make. They have to weigh various kinds of insurance against all the other things they need to buy, like groceries and pay their mortgage, etc. So they made a choice. Maybe a single guy didn't have maternity benefits in his policy. Is that substandard for a single guy? Of course not. It's a rational choice. Why would you buy maternity benefits? And you can go down the list. See, states, here's another thing that is part of the regulatory cartel I mentioned. The states for years have been adding mandatory, quote, benefits to insurance policies. And the reason they do that is because the people who provide those so-called benefits, the vendors, go to the state legislatures and lobby and say, you should pass a law making my service that I provide a mandatory part of all insurance coverage because it's so important. Plus, I also want to make the profit by selling this, mandatorily. So governments have done that. State governments have done that to different degrees in different states. Some are worse than others. Some have a long list of mandated benefits. Others have a smaller list. But that increases the cost of insurance. One reason why people get priced out of the insurance market is because government keeps piling on coverage that people wouldn't voluntarily buy, like in vitro fertilization or hair transplants or all kinds of things. It's ridiculous. So there's been no free market in insurance. So Obama can't come along and say we're reforming the free market in insurance because there was no such thing. And he's made it worse.
Yeah, but that's what they always say. I mean, this strategy goes all the way back to the New Deal, where, the Federal Reserve initiates policies that result in the stock market crash in 29, and they blame it on the failure of the free enterprise system and then use that as the excuse to enact an entire new agenda for Americans that are based on socialistic principles and interventionist principles. This is what they always do. They blame it on the free market, and then they get this interventionism. And I think we're seeing the classic example of what Ludwig von Mises argued with respect to interventionism, that one intervention creates a whole new host of problems, chaos, crises, that then call for more interventions, and that produces a whole new set of problems, which call for new interventions. And each one of these interventions extends government control over people's lives to a greater extent. So that really what this thing, to me, is going to morph into is what Hillary Clinton wanted to do originally, and which she might well do if she's elected president, or really a total government control over health care, which is what the situation is in Cuba, which is held up as a model by many of the people on the left side of the spectrum. Seems to me that if we keep traveling this road, where intervention follows reform follows interventionism, that's where we're headed.
Yeah, well, of course, it goes way back before the New Deal. The New Deal was just a possibly more comprehensive approach, employing the same old philosophy. And rather than call it socialist, I would call it corporatist, because every step of the way, there are big companies that are in partnership with government that are making out very well as a result of these interventions. I mean, the story I just told about the state-mandated benefits, that's motivated by companies that are providing whatever the service or good is. Now, of course, they put it in humanitarian terms. Of course, everybody should have this coverage. They can't very well succeed if they say, make this coverage mandatory so our bottom lines will look better. That won't fly. Instead, you talk about how good it is for everybody else. But, of course, they're making out. And under Obamacare, the insurance companies will do and are doing extremely well because buying insurance is mandatory. You have to do it. Now, a lot of the money may come from the taxpayers because a lot of people are going to get subsidized, but it still goes into the pockets of the insurance companies. They have no reason to complain. They'll take mandates and other kinds of regulations in return for guaranteed business. They'll take it any day of the week. They have historically. So this is rank corporatism, and Obama is the worst offender.
I agree with you. I mean, I might call it corporate socialism. I mean, because you've got this huge amount of money that is going into the pockets of the privileged class. It's really Bastiat's concept of where people look to the state as the great fiction by which everyone's trying to live at the expense of everyone else. Here we have the case where the big corporations, the big insurance companies, the beneficiaries of all this government largesse that's been taken from hardworking people, they've got their hands in the cookie jar trying to get their fair share. And so what ends up happening when you have this kind of system? You've got this, it's really much like the military and the military industrial complex, where you've got an entire sector of the economy that is now dependent on this government largesse, and they're fighting tooth and nail to continue it, including doctors and hospitals, and let's not forget Medicare recipients and Medicaid recipients, the numbers of which go up every day as the baby boomers start retiring and get into the system. So, how does that impact a nation when you've got this kind of system where more and more people are trying to get into the pockets of the fewer number of people that are still working? I don't see how this can end up in anything except bad, because you've got people that are so dependent on the system and so fighting so hard to keep it going.
Well, and they wouldn't want it any other way. They don't want to exist in a freely competitive open market. Nothing's certain in an open market. You don't hold market share except through hard work in an open market. That's too hard. Better to go to the government and get it. I mean, I like the distinction made by the libertarian sociologist Franz Oppenheimer, who pointed out that there's two ways to acquire wealth, not earn wealth, acquire wealth. One is work and exchange, the market, what he called the economic means, and one is legal plunder, to use Bastiat's term, namely using the state to have it taken from someone and given to you. That's the political means. And these big companies, and insurance has been a creature of the state for many, many years. It's nothing new. Prefer the political means. I mean, we don't even really have insurance. It's not insurance. What we have is prepayment for future, consumption of future consumption of services. It's not the old style insurance where if a defined thing happens to you, you get a certain amount of money as outlined in your initial contract. In other words, it's not an indemnity where you got a lump sum. When you have health insurance, you don't even ever see the money, right? The money goes to the hospital or to the doctor. You don't get it. And you can't even choose to forego a procedure. Let's say it's not a life-threatening thing. You can't just get the money from the insurance and say, well, I'm not going to do the procedure. I'll just spend this money on something else, as you can say with your car. If your car's dented and they pay off, you're not obligated to spend that money to fix the dent. That's up to you. The deal was if X happens to you, you get Y amount of money. But insurance is you're just paying in advance for services you may consume in the future. It's not true insurance. It's all been distorted and twisted by government intervention. It's as much the current insurance industry today, especially in medical insurance, is as much a creature of the state as Medicare and Medicaid is. That's how I'll put it.
Yeah, I mean, it's human nature that when you're being offered something for, quote, free, you're likely to take it. And we've seen this in the healthcare arena. When they developed Medicare, they didn't say, well, if you need help, we will provide it for you. They said, we're going to provide it for you even if you're a multimillionaire. Well, how many multimillionaires say, well, I'm going to pass up on Medicare because I really don't need it. I can handle the expenses. I would say very few, because it's this idea of, sort of the Social Security idea. I put it in, I have a right to get it out, and it doesn't matter how much money I have, it's free. And then if they offer services as part of that coverage, it's likely that a person's going to say, well, I wouldn't have done it if I had to pay for it, but since it's free, I might as well do it. And you brought up this point really well on our tour there that we did at with the Young Americans for Liberty a couple of weeks ago, where we were driving along and you were telling me about the hazards of this mental health coverage for young people that was part of this whole Obamacare package. And then, tell people what happened the very next day as we were opening up the newspaper.
Well, right. 2 days in a row, USA Today ran the lead article about how this mental health coverage can undermines the full premise, the actual premise of the Affordable Care Act. And the New York Times basically did the same thing, and in its lead story, page 1 the next day. I mean, the premise of the ACA is if we force young, healthy people young people who on average are healthier and don't use much in the way of medical services, we force them to buy insurance. And then, since they're mostly going to be paying in and drawing relatively little out, that will give them the money, the government the money to pay for the insurance and therefore the medical services of people who can't get insurance or who have very low income or for one reason or another. That's the premise. But if it turns out that young people are drawing out much more than they anticipated, than the system anticipates, then the premise is shaky. Because the idea is that they're pretty much supposed to be huge net contributors, not takers out of money from the system. But the USA Today story points out that young people use, quote, mental health services for things like depression, anxiety, eating disorders. They see therapists. They go to doctors to get prescriptions for various kinds of drugs, and so they're not. They use the services much more than has been anticipated. I go even further. Of course, once you make the price of those services artificially cheap. And they will be because of just the way the system is set up, the way the ACA sets up the insurance coverage. The co-pays and deductibles, can't be higher in the mental health area than they are in the medical health area. There's this so-called parity that's required. People will partake even more because the prices will be artificially low. Now, this is an area, unlike real medicine, this is an area of service where the complaint is highly subjective and can't be objectively determined. I mean, I'm invoking the work of Thomas Szasz and other people, that if someone says, I feel anxious, there's no way to test that. If someone says, I'm feeling down, I'm feeling depressed, but they don't get a brain scan. Their complaint is simply noted by the doctor, and you can either have talk therapy or get drugs. So these aren't like going in and saying I feel like I have bronchitis, and the doctor can look and say, yeah, you do, or you don't. So there's going to be an explosion of costs here. It's a ticking time bomb. The whole system will come falling down when this explosion of costs occurs.
Yeah, I know we've talked about this before, but I think it's really important to emphasize is where we libertarians come out on this, because the solution is really, in my opinion, what distinguishes us from the conservatives. I mean, conservatives would like to see Obamacare repealed, but implicit in that is that they seem to think that everything will be fine if they repeal Obamacare. But it won't be fine. I mean, keep in mind that there was a reason why Obamacare was adopted in the first place. That was because there was a huge healthcare crisis. And while the liberals, the progressives will say, well, that's because of the free market, we know it's different. It's not because of the free market. It's because of state interventionism, these socialistic programs, these corporatist programs that have just totally warped what could have been the greatest healthcare system in the world, one that is truly based on free markets. And I think it's important that we do in this show what we were doing on the road with those college students, and that is to raise people's vision to a higher level. That just because we've been born and raised in a system of Medicare and Medicaid and occupational licensure and insurance regulation and an income tax manipulation that encourages employers to buy policies for the employees, this doesn't have to be. That just because we're born and raised in such a system doesn't mean that we can't get rid of it, which is exactly what we should do. And I know there's another thing we talked about on that college tour is that if there was a button that could be pushed that would totally separate healthcare in the state immediately, like a constitutional amendment, that prohibits the government from involving itself in health care, I'd push it. I'd push it immediately. because I have absolutely no doubts you would have the greatest resurgence of dynamism and dynamics and prosperity and health in the healthcare arena, along with, of course, the entire welfare state, whereas I think you ought to do the same thing.
Well, and of course, in order to get to that position, we're going to need to persuade a lot of people that markets work. I mean, if we their problem with our saying get rid of Medicare, Medicaid, and all this corporatism in the insurance industry is they can't imagine what would take the place of those things. Our job is to fill in their imagination by telling them how markets work. Otherwise, it sounds like we're just taking a leap of faith. Oh, don't worry, get rid of the stuff, and don't worry, we just have faith that everything will work out. Well, we can say much more than that. We know how markets operate, and we can spell that out. And that will take some of the nervousness out of people if they see, oh yeah, there's actually a market process that operates. It doesn't need government to keep it going, and that works just by people trying to better their situations and engaging in exchange. So that's how I see our job, convincing them that it's not a leap of faith, that we know how markets work, and that this is something that we can establish through logical argument.
I agree. I mean, in a sense, our situation is much like the Russian people that were living with state factories that produce shoes. And when somebody suggested to them, well, why don't you just let the free market produce shoes? Get rid of all these state factories. It terrified people. Like, well, wait a minute, how can we be guaranteed that shoes will be produced and in the right colors and the right sizes? Oh no, we can't just turn this thing over to the free market. And the reason was because they hadn't experienced it. And I think that's the problem we face in healthcare, is that we've all been born and raised under this system, or at least most people, at least under the welfare state. I mean, Medicare and Medicaid came into existence in the 60s, so some of us still have memories of what healthcare was like before this government interventionism. And so, I think you're right. If people can get a grasp of how markets work in other areas, that the grocery stores get filled with food and there's not some central planner there telling the grocers, what to buy and in what quantities and so forth, that they can see then how that would apply to a healthcare field where you don't have government intervening, you don't have government taking care of people, providing a protection racket for doctors with licensure laws, protecting the big corporations, the big insurance companies with regulation, and then just letting free people operate within a marketplace.
Yeah, and the Soviet Union, the advocates of markets had an advantage we don't have, because they could point to the West and say, well, look, the state doesn't own the shoe factories there, and people seem to have nice shoes. Even low-income people have, nice shoes and a huge variety. Westerners were visiting, so they could see that firsthand. We can't point to a free market medical system and say, see, it does work. Look over there. So we have to engage more in the logical argument to spell it out, which makes it a little tougher for people. If we could point to a system that already existed, that make our job a little easier. But unfortunately, states and big, privileged interests routinely get together and set up the kind of system that we're trying to change. So we can't readily point to a free market system. That doesn't mean it can't exist. It just means the corporatist temptation is very strong, and states and big companies always get together. We just need to stop them from doing it.
Yeah, but as difficult as our task is as libertarians, the statists don't have an easy task themselves, because all they can do is point to failure. I mean, that is the legacy of the welfare state, is failure, and then followed by reform, and more government control over our lives. And so they can keep holding this carrot out in front of people saying, well, if you'll just give us one more reform, we'll get it right, whether it's in immigration or health care or any other part of our lives, drug war and so forth. So all they've got is failure. That gives us an advantage. But I also think that it's really important to talk about moral principles, because this is you're never going to hear this among conservatives, and especially not in the mainstream press. And that is this this whole fundamental notion that underlies the welfare state, including Medicare, Medicaid, and all the other socialist, corporatist type programs, that notion that it's morally right that the government takes money from one group of people and gives it to another group of people. And I know you wrote a great piece on this last week, and it even got circulated on a liberal progressive site. And I think it's a really critical point that we make here, that it's not morally right for the government to take money from one group of people and give it to another group of people. That's just legalized plunder, as Bastiat said, or legalized stealing. And that the only proper system is a system where everybody keeps his own resources, decides what to do with them, provide health care, charity, donate, invest, or whatever. And that's the system that produces prosperity, harmony, high levels of health care. That's really to me what really distinguishes libertarians from conservatives and liberals.
Yeah, I agree. In this article that you referred to that I did last week, just simply pointed out that most people apply that principle in their daily lives to other private individuals. They don't think it would be right to steal from their neighbors in order to provide health coverage to low-income people. People would think of that as a crime and would want to see that stop. But if someone who's been elected to Congress proposes to do it, and then authorizes another branch of the government to do it, that gets judged by a different moral standard. And so I was just calling attention, and other people have done this in the past, including Bastiat, called attention to the double standard and asking for proof of the double standard, because I see no case for how government officials can have rights that each individual fails to have. I mean, how do we get together and create rights as a group that didn't exist, and then delegate that to another group of people? It doesn't make any sense. So that was the point I was trying to make in that article. So I agree with you. Ultimately, it comes down to a moral principle that there's no right to steal. There's no right. I like to put it in more generally. There's no right to use other people as merely means to your own ends, no matter how noble the ends may sound.
Well, that's to me the beautiful part of libertarianism is it's consistent. It's based on moral principles. It's based on the principles of liberty, freedom of choice. But it also is a system that produces a better healthcare system, more economic prosperity, more dynamism, more excitement, as compared to what we have today, where all we have is chaos, crises, whether you're looking at healthcare or immigration or the drug war or terrorism, wherever they're involved with the welfare warfare state. It's a system that is sort of depressing. It gets people despondent, hopeless, and dependent. And as compared to the libertarian paradigm, which is, to me, is exciting and dynamic and provides hope, gives people the opportunity to become wealthy and to have better health care and so forth, and to provide the opportunity to be good to your neighbor on a voluntary basis as compared to going through the coercive apparatus of the state. We only have a couple minutes left, Sheldon, but I did want to bring up the idea of privacy in the NSA. I mean, it's back in the news. There's Germans that are saying that Germany ought to give Snowden asylum there. And I think that this is another important area, and maybe we ought to talk about it in a future issue, this issue of privacy, because it seems that even some libertarians don't see the extreme importance of privacy in terms of the overall aspect of liberty. I mean, to me, it's just this notion that you have a right to be left alone. You have a right to engage in your private affairs without the government watching you and monitoring you. And I think the founders had it right, that if the authorities believe somebody's committing a crime and they have cause to believe that, probable cause, they go to a judge, they get a warrant, and they spy on that particular person for that particular alleged crime. But for the rest of us, leave us alone. Let us email where we want, say what we want without having to worry, and talk on the phone with whomever we want without worrying about whether somebody from the government's watching us.
Well, I agree, and you referred me to a very good article this morning by the columnist at The Atlantic, Connor Friedersdorf, who made a very interesting point, very simple, elementary point, that most people who are attacking critics of the NSA and all this spying, people who say, no, we need it for our safety, would never propose that blinds and draperies and shades be outlawed so that the police can look through your window, or that we should have glass walls so that bad people couldn't hide their activities. That would strike almost anybody as absurd. And yet, when it comes to digital matters, emails and things like that, suddenly they want this extraordinary power for government to eavesdrop and otherwise monitor what we do. I think that was a great point. I mean, doesn't the logic of surveillance lead to glass walls, which was actually used in a novel by a Russian called We, which was came out before Ayn Rand's Anthem and is said to have inspired Rand. But it was one of these dystopian novels of a totalitarian society, and there all the dwellings had to have glass transparent walls so that the authorities could be keeping an eye on you at all times.
Yeah, and it's another classic example of Mises's dictum that interventionism leads to more interventionism, and you can see it with the entire national security state, where they go abroad and they have policies that produce the anger and hatred that produces the terrorist threat, and they use the terrorist threat to come over here and establish a huge super secret surveillance scheme. They get mad because people discover it. They say, oh, well, if it didn't matter as long as people didn't know that we were recording their phone calls and reading their emails and so forth. But it does matter. I mean, you should be able to, as a part of a free person, of knowing that the government doesn't even have the capability. I mean, that's why we libertarians say just dismantle this Cold War relic, dismantle the NSA. Don't sit there and reform it and rein it in, because you're never going to know whether they're complying with the law anyway. And they're not going to comply with the law. They're going to try to protect national security. They're going to do it secretly. So you get rid of the whole Cold War national security state, the military-industrial complex, the CIA. Then you don't even need to worry about this anymore. It'd be the best thing we could ever do for a free and prosperous and peaceful society.
No, well, I agree with that. The government causes, as you say, causes problems, and then appears as the great benefactor who's going to solve the very problems it causes. Once we get people to understand that, I think they'll catch on pretty quickly how that applies across the board. And we just need to keep pointing it out.
Yeah, well, on that note, Sheldon, our time's up. So I want to thank y'all for tuning in to the show. And this has been the Libertarian Angle. It's always great to visit with you guys on a weekly basis. And we'll talk to you next week.